In the archives of Seville, Spain, there's a letter that was never meant to be found. Written in 1598 by a Filipino scribe named Tondo, it describes something the Spanish crown ordered destroyed, the memory of what the Philippines was before they arrived. The letter reads, "They tell us we were savages before the cross came. But I remember my grandfather's books, written in scripts they now forbid us to read. I remember courts of law, trade agreements with Ming China, and a word we had for freedom that has no translation in their tongue. For 333 years, from 1565 to 1898, Spain didn't just colonize the Philippines, they attempted to erase an entire civilization's memory of itself. This is the story of what they tried to hide and how Filipinos kept their truth alive in the silence. The civilization Spain found the forgotten kingdoms. Hey, history lovers, quick favor before we start. If you enjoy today's video, please help me reach 500 likes. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing historical stories. Before Spanish galleons appeared on the horizon in 1521, the Philippine archipelago wasn't a primitive backwater waiting for salvation. It was a thriving network of independent kingdoms and sultanates that had been trading with China for over 1,000 years. The Rajanate of Butuan minted its own gold coins. The Sultanate of Sulu controlled trade routes extending to Borneo and beyond. In Manila, Raja Suleiman ruled over a fortified city-state with diplomatic relations spanning Southeast Asia. But here's what makes this mysterious. We know these civilizations existed, yet we have almost no written records from their perspective. Why? Because the Spanish systematically destroyed them. The lost scripts. When Spanish missionaries arrived, they found Filipinos using multiple writing systems, Baybayin, Kawi, and Arabic script among them. These weren't primitive scratches, but sophisticated systems for recording laws, poetry, trade agreements, and history. The Doctrina Christiana, printed in 1593, proves Filipinos were literate before Spanish arrival. It's printed in both Spanish and Tagalog, using Baybayin script. Yet within 2 generations, these scripts had almost completely disappeared. A Spanish friar named Francisco Colin wrote in 1663. The natives had their own form of writing, which they learned without teachers. But this is disappearing, because the doctrine and good example of the friars have shown them the error of their ways. Translation: we made them forget how to read their own history. The architecture of erasure, the encomienda system. Colonization by design. Spain's colonization wasn't just military conquest, it was systematic cultural engineering. The encomienda system gave Spanish colonizers control over Filipino communities, making natives into forced laborers on their own land. But the psychological dimension was more insidious. Spanish law declared Filipinos legal minors who needed Spanish guardianship. They weren't just conquered, they were legally redefined as children who had never grown up. The reducción erasing the map. Between 1565 and 1600, Spanish authorities implemented reducción, the forced relocation of scattered Filipino communities into centralized towns built around Catholic churches. On the surface, this seemed like urban planning. In reality, it was cultural destruction. Filipino communities had lived in kinship-based settlements called barangays, organized around extended family networks and traditional leadership. Reducción deliberately broke these bonds, mixing different groups together under Spanish-appointed officials. When you destroy how people organize space, you destroy how they organize memory. Grandparents could no longer pass down oral histories in familiar gathering places. Sacred sites were abandoned or built over with churches. The silence in the records. Here's where the mystery deepens. We have thousands of pages of Spanish colonial documents, but Filipino voices are almost entirely absent. When they do appear, they're filtered through Spanish translators and scribes. Modern historians call this archival violence, the way historical records themselves become weapons. The Spanish didn't just write history, they made it impossible for Filipinos to write their own. But in the margins of Spanish documents, scholars have found something fascinating. Small acts of resistance. A scribe who mistranslates Spanish orders to protect his community. A town record keeper who secretly uses pre-colonial dating systems. A notary who hides indigenous names within Spanish legal documents. Survival in the shadows. The hidden transcripts. Political scientist James C. Scott coined the term hidden transcripts. The unofficial stories subjugated people tell when those in power aren't listening. In colonial Philippines, these hidden transcripts took many forms. Oral traditions, epic poems like the Darangan of the Maranao people and the Hudhud of the Ifugao preserved pre-colonial history, laws, and values. Chanted during rice harvests and rituals, these epics kept alive memories of indigenous governance and identity. Folk Catholicism. Filipinos didn't simply accept Spanish Catholicism, they merged it with indigenous beliefs. The result was a hybrid religion, where Catholic saints took on attributes of pre-colonial deities, and indigenous healing practices continued under Catholic cover. Material culture. Traditional weaving patterns, pottery designs, and architectural elements encoded cultural knowledge that written records couldn't preserve. A Tiboli woman's intricate beadwork wasn't just decoration. It was a text only her community could fully read. The unreachable interior Spain claimed to rule the entire archipelago, but this was largely fiction. In the mountainous Cordilleras of northern Luzon, the Igorot people remained unconquered. In Mindanao and Sulu, Muslim sultanates resisted Spanish control throughout the colonial period. These independent regions became refugees for Filipino identity. While coastal areas experienced intense Hispanization, highland and Muslim communities maintained pre-colonial governance, languages, and customs. Spanish authorities called these areas Tierra no Pacificada, unpacified lands, framing Filipino resistance as savagery. But really, these were zones of Filipino sovereignty, proof that Spanish colonization was never total. The underground economy official Spanish records paint a picture of economic domination. But beneath the surface, Filipinos maintained parallel economic systems. Chinese mestizo merchants operating in the gray zones of colonial law facilitated trade networks the Spanish couldn't fully control. In provinces distant from Manila, tribute payments were negotiated rather than enforced. Local leaders collected Spanish taxes but redistributed wealth according to traditional patterns of reciprocity, preserving pre-colonial social obligations within colonial structures. The price of silence. What was lost? The human cost of Spanish colonization is almost impossible to calculate. Population estimates suggest the Philippines had 500,000 to 1 million people in 1565. By 1600, that number may have been cut in half due to disease, forced labor, and warfare. But beyond demographic collapse, there's a loss that's harder to quantify: cultural amnesia. Today, most Filipinos can't read the writing systems their ancestors used. Pre-colonial Filipino music, legal systems, and scientific knowledge exist only in fragments. Entire languages vanished. The Philippines has over 180 languages today, but linguists estimate hundreds more disappeared during Spanish rule. Each lost language was a unique way of understanding the world, gone forever. The mestizo question. By the 19th century, a new class emerged: Filipino mestizos of mixed Spanish-Filipino or Chinese-Filipino ancestry. These mestizos would lead the Philippine independence movement, producing intellectuals like José Rizal. But here's the painful irony: the very people who fought for Filipino freedom were products of colonial mixing. They wrote their manifestos in Spanish, the colonizers' language. Their education came from the colonial system. This creates a profound question. Can you reclaim an identity that colonization has fundamentally altered? Is the pre-colonial past even recoverable, or is Filipino identity now inescapably hybrid? The ghost in Filipino culture. Travel to the Philippines today, and you'll see the legacy of 333 years of Spanish rule everywhere. Catholic churches in every town, Spanish loanwords in Tagalog, family structures influenced by colonial law. But you'll also see something else: traces of what came before. Indigenous festivals adapted to Catholic calendar, concepts of utang na loob, debt of gratitude, and pakikisama, social harmony, that predates Spanish arrival. A relationship with land and sea that Catholic cosmology never fully displaced. Filipino culture today is palimpsest, a manuscript where the original text was scraped away and overwritten. But if you look closely, you can still see the ghost of what came before. Memory's rebellion, the return of the suppressed. In 1987, 2 years after the Philippines overthrew the Marcos dictatorship, the country adopted a new constitution. Article 14, Section 6 reads, "The national language of the Philippines is Filipino. The regional languages are the auxiliary official languages in the regions, and shall serve as auxiliary media of instruction therein." This seems bureaucratic, but it's actually revolutionary. For the first time since 1565, Filipino languages were legally equal to colonial languages in official use. In universities, scholars began reconstructing pre-colonial Philippine history using archaeological evidence, surviving oral traditions, and critical readings of Spanish colonial documents. What emerged was startling: proof of sophisticated civilizations Spain had tried to erase. In 1999, UNESCO recognized the Ifugao rice terraces as a World Heritage Site, calling them a living cultural landscape of unparalleled beauty. These 2,000-year-old terraces, built without colonial influence, prove Filipino engineering and agricultural genius. Decolonizing memory. Today, Filipino activists and scholars are engaged in what they call decolonization, not just political independence, which came in 1946, but psychological and cultural liberation from colonial ways of thinking. This means learning indigenous languages, reviving traditional arts, and critically examining how colonial history still shapes Filipino self-perception. It means asking, what did Spain teach us to forget? What did they teach us to be ashamed of? And it means recognizing that the silence Spain imposed was never complete. In oral traditions, In hybrid practices, in zones of resistance, Filipinos kept their truth alive. Closing. The Power of Hidden History, 1930 to 20. The story of Spanish colonization in the Philippines isn't unique. It's a pattern repeated across the globe, wherever empires expanded. But what makes it instructive is how thoroughly Spain tried to erase pre-colonial memory and how completely they failed. Because here's what colonizers never understand. You can burn books, forbid languages, and destroy monuments, but you can't erase memory from a people who refuse to forget. Every oral tradition passed down, every indigenous practice hidden within colonial forms, every act of quiet resistance was a form of survival. And survival, over 333 years, becomes resistance. And resistance, eventually, becomes freedom. The silence Spain imposed on the Philippines was never really silence. It was a different kind of speaking, one that waited for the right moment to become loud again. Close.